Today on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, I want to share one of my most listened to episodes, and we'll get to that right after this. Looking for an effective way to connect with unbelievers and introduce them to Jesus? Contagious Disciple Making does just that. And their Philosophy and Strategy of Disciple Making Movement's live online class is starting very soon. To learn more, go to contagiousdisciplemaking.com/class to pre-register. Learn about Discovery Bible Study, disciple-making movements, the importance of prayer, and building a community that seeks to make disciples from founder Paul Watson and personal coach Rebecca Ewing. Sign up today and let them know that Christian Nerds Unite sent you. And now, back to the show. I have been super busy this past week with projects, caring for my wife, and serving our ground partners while my ministry partner is out of the country. Because of that, today I want to share a special encore episode, our interview with Professor Michael Joachski, author of The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth. Let's jump right into the episode. Michael teaches humanities at St. Petersburg College in Florida and released his book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth, last year. But before we get into the interview, let's read some scripture together. We're going to read Ephesians 6:10 through 17. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything to stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one, and take up the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Now, this passage comes to mind quite often when I'm reading through The Lord of the Rings, just because of some of the symbolism here. Talking about the powers of this world and much like the seeming supernatural evil that Tolkien wrote about. The hobbits and the men and women in the story take up the physical armor and weapons, while we must take up the armor of God and the Word of God as our defense against the evil of this world. I pray that you will take up the armor of God and the Word of God on a daily basis. Now, let's get to my interview with Michael Joachski. Michael, welcome to the show. It is great to have you.
Happy to be on, Ricky. Thanks for having me.
So, Michael, you are you're a professor of humanities at St. Petersburg College in Florida. Is that right?
Yep.
And the author of The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth. And I'm pretty excited about this book. I'm in the middle of it right now, and some interesting things that you bring up. But kind of tell us who is Michael? Why do people know Michael?
Oh, well, I guess I should probably mention the nerdy part of me first, given the podcast. So I grew up a Nintendo kid. I take my Switch Lite with me everywhere. I tell my students some days I'm in a mood. We should settle grading disputes with Smash Brothers matches if we get to it. So I'm a kid at heart. I know that's very cliched. We hear that a lot, but I mean, for goodness sake, if you know me, you know it's true. Big Pokemon fan. I've had to catch up on a lot of my youth. We moved around so much as a kid, so I use that as my excuse to say, oh, I can play this game now. Super psyched that ActRaiser just came out, old favorite Super Nintendo game of mine. I don't know if anybody's familiar. ActRaiser 1, not 2. The music. So it really a trip down memory lane in the last week. So I should start with the fun. Not that the other parts aren't fun, but I'm a big nerd, and I love my Nintendo games. So I'm a husband, a father, an author. I've got two wonderful kids, Lucas and Annabelle. They're 7 and 4. Keep me busy, and as you said, I teach humanities at St. Petersburg College here, where it's hot year round. So we've got nice, crisp 98-degree weather still, and enjoying it.
Awesome. Well, since you wrote the book about Return of the King, let's start there with your experience with Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
How did you get interested in Tolkien's writings and specifically in the Lord of the Rings? Where did that start with you?
Yeah. So I tell the story in the preface of the book, but my nerdy, I've got two brothers and two sisters. My nerdy older brother Chris, and I mean that of course in the highest respect to him. He got me
Absolutely.
into, yeah, it's a compliment. And his love for the books, and clearly he had been reading them. I didn't know that he was in 2001, right before the movies came out. I don't know how long he had been reading them before that, but he said, we ought to read this before we see the movie. And I said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So before December of '01, my brother Chris started reading me The Fellowship of the Ring, and that was my first encounter. We didn't finish the books, or that book, and I didn't finish any of the others. I didn't get to the Silmarillion until a few years later, as I gradually started devouring the books after the movies came out, and kind of finished them as I went. I don't remember exactly when I finished what, but as I got kind of hooked on it because of him. We saw the first movie, and then I started reading and just didn't stop from there. And I was one of those, guys who had to point out all the differences. Of course, the books were just infinitely better. Oh, that's not how it happened.
Agree.
Oh, yeah,
Absolutely agree.
with the Hobbit movies especially. My God, yeah, I know that's another thing.
Don't get me
Another,
started on the
don't
Hobbit
get me started.
movies.
We'll be here 2 hours. Yeah. Yeah, that's how I encountered it. It's funny. I look back and I tell the story in the book is that my mom had, we grew up Catholic, and so Catholicism is still close to my heart, and we're still trying to find a perfect, I know there's no perfect church, but we're still trying to find a good church home right now between Catholicism and Protestantism. Anyway, my mom, we all kind of stopped going to church, and then around 2000, 2001, my mom rediscovered, Christianity. She had gotten in a really bad car accident. And I saw her faith kind of, expanding and becoming important. So I would sit with her, we'd read scripture. And that happened around the same time Chris was reading Lord of the Rings. I didn't see any kind of connection between the two as I was rediscovering my faith and discovering Tolkien for the first time. But it's been interesting to look back and see how those two things were actually related years later.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I know traditionally people say that the Lord of the Rings is not allegorical
Mm,
because Tolkien says in a particular letter that he despises allegory basically,
sure.
and that it was never intended to be an allegory. But I know in your book you kind of bring this around a little bit. Can you tell us a
Mhm.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I'll give the tip of the iceberg, but a lot of these words, allegory, metaphor, parable, they all have a lot in common. I wouldn't say
Hmm.
they're all equivalent. That's hardly the case, but they can often say the same thing in different ways. One biblical scholar, Klein Snodgrass, his work, Stories with Intent, was really helpful, where he said that for years, biblical scholars have been trying to make a distinction between allegories doing one thing as a genre and parables doing another, that in fact they're both sometimes translucent to the reality they want to show. And I think the concern, just to start with this, for Tolkien was that he didn't want people, even seeing it as a Catholic and broadly Christian book, to just see that and not any of the merits of the story. He didn't want, just like he was annoyed with certain interpretations of the book, so he didn't want it to just be reduced to that, to get in the way, right? But the truth is, Snodgrass says, parables and allegories, if you try to say that one does a worse job at kind of concealing the intent of the story and the author, they really don't. So I found that there's a lot of slipperiness with these terms. Okay. And as I dug even deeper, I found that allegory more broadly is something that Tolkien did not despise. He disliked, and despised probably is a better word, even though he used the word disliked in the foreword to the second edition of The Lord of the Rings. What you find when you look at other letters like letter 186 and letter 181, if you're familiar with the Humphrey Carpenter collection, and several others, is that it was one specific kind of allegory that in letter 131 he said was a conscious and intentional allegory. That's the one that he disliked. But when you read, I think it's letter, I'm looking here, it's letter 186. He says that The Lord of the Rings is an allegory, just not of atomic power, but of power exerted for dominion. So this was pointed out by a Tolkien scholar, Catholic scholar no less, Joseph Pearce. And I said, well, that's interesting. So it's an allegory. It's just not that kind of allegory. And I'll stop there for now, because that was the first kind of mind grenade for me. As I said, wow, so he doesn't hate all allegory. He just really disliked the very transparent, translucent, in your face, maybe Bunyan-esque type, and I don't want to knock C.S. Lewis, because I don't think his books are all that allegorical. People say that all the time, but I think they're more well told than people think. That was the first big point in my journey. So I think that's a good start to the subject.
I was about to say, is that kind of what set you on a course of writing this book, or was there something else?
That was the thing. Yeah. Ricky, that was really the main, I would say, motivation. Although I also wanted to write for myself, because there was just this weird, I said it was weird at the time, and I don't feel guilty for it anymore. And it's a silly thing to feel guilty for, but I related in a strange, symbiotic way to the characters in the book. And I was just like, I felt like I was being summoned, and with the character of Aragorn, I'm like, oh, I want to go and follow him. I want to go do that. I want my life to feel urgent. And I thought, I can't imagine I'm the only person who's ever felt this way about a story. And so at first I was feeling, I know it sounds weird, but kind of shame and like, well, it's just a fantasy book. And as I read some serious scholars like Peter Kreeft and others, he has a passage that explains this appeal, that it's buried in our subconscious, that we want an Arthurian-like king. We want a cause to devote ourselves to. I started, making connections, thinking, well, this is what Jesus is. And so that was another reason. I had to explore the books and make sense of it for myself. But yeah, then I was frustrated. I'm like, well, how can I write about that, and how the book reflects and communicates the truth of the Christian worldview without squelching and silencing the voices of the other cultures Tolkien loved so much, and without just saying that it's another way of reading your Bible, because it's not. And it's not just a reductive retelling of the Bible. How can I do that when Tolkien was so adamant against allegory? So I juggled those two things, and that's what I write about. So the introduction in chapter 1, which is a hefty portion of the book, is dedicated to kind of laying the foundation and the groundwork, and then getting into that. And then once that's out of the way, the rest of the book is all about that feeling that I had, that summons, if you will. So that's why I wrote the book.
Now, one of the other things that you kind of lean into is, as far as the allegory part, is and correct me if I'm wrong, you kind of allude to the idea that it's hard to separate when you say something is allegorical. You can get it from, as you said, Tolkien talks about the intentional allegory written into the story,
right?
And the unintentional allegory that we as readers perceive from the text. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I certainly can. And let me also recommend for your viewers and listeners, and yourself, if you're interested, a shout out to another Whitman Stock author. My book was published with Whitman Stock. Gisela Kreglinger has a great book about, I think it's George MacDonald, and some other authors, and more broadly about Jesus's parables. The book is called Storied Revelations. And this was a revelation reading her book, because she was talking about the same sorts of subjects, but with different authors. And she mentions Tolkien a couple times, but she reminds us that biblical scholars have shown that allegory, and again, allegoria is a Greek word. It means vaguely to speak one thing, to speak of something else. So anything that speaks of something else, right, is
Right.
the most general meaning. But she says, look, we can distinguish between allegory as a composition, that is a type of literature.
Mhm.
We can also speak of allegoresis, which is interpreting a work that isn't allegory and composition, but as one, which is what you alluded to. And then we can also speak of allegorical as a mode of languaging. That is a way of using language. And she says, and I'm quoting her pretty loosely here, but this is the gist of what she says, that allegorical language is much clearer than opposed to what? Metaphorical language, which we can talk about later. But
Mhm.
it's very, its purpose is not to advance knowledge, it's to remind you of what you already know. So therefore, it's more transparent. So it might be like a thinly veiled character that really is just a pushover for Jesus, or some other stark Christian theme that should be blatantly obvious. It's more direct, and so it's not really trying to conceal the message so much. And that's allegorical as a mode. And I think that what was really helpful, I say a couple times in my book, that can be helpful in helping us understand how Tolkien used this word allegory. He never felt the need to be overly technical, but I think using scholarship carefully today, we can possibly infer that he was sometimes, on the one hand, upset about when a work became a whole allegory as a composition, whereby what this would entail is having the whole text be filled with that allegorical languaging, which is very clear. And he says, I think, in his introduction to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, just that, is that the whole work has to amount to this equals that. So he disliked that. But I think he also alluded to a dislike of too much of the allegorical mode in a story that, like his own, that is not going to ultimately be dominated by that, but by more suggestive kind of language and better concealed language. So I think maybe making the distinction between composition, allegory as composition, and allegorical as mode is very helpful for people looking to get into Tolkien. But it requires, looking outside of Tolkien scholarship to see what biblical scholars and textual critics have said about these terms. So it's a lot of research.
Well, as far as Lord of the Rings goes, I mean,
Mhm.
anyone who's a writer, what they have experienced is going to be poured into what they're writing.
Mhm.
And Tolkien admits himself that it is a Christian story because he is a Christian. He grew up Catholic, so he even basically calls it a Catholic story at some
Mhm.
point, simply because that's who he is, and who he is going to come out in the story. Um,
Precisely.
so a lot of people have also talked about other things, more secular things in his life that
Mhm.
affected the Lord of the Rings story. Do you have
Mhm.
much to say about that? Because I know a lot of people have alluded to the idea that, well, it's somewhat, they feel like it's somewhat influenced by his experiences in World War One,
Mhm.
or some of his beliefs as far as you know ecology, or some of his thoughts on the industrialization of the world at the time. What do you know about that? How
Sure.
do you feel about some of those ideas?
Not my area of expertise, but I would say I feel that all of these things broadly fit within a Christian reading and telling and reading of the Lord of the Rings, because if we plug these things into a Christian framework or worldview of reality, we should be caring for creation. We should be concerned with other cultures and religions, and Christianity not domineering them, but finding a way of them fitting in with the complete narrative. So, in the Christian worldview, these other religions that have truth in them too get an honored place, because if you believe that Christianity is a complete truth, and God, as C.S. Lewis said, sent good dreams to the pagans to pave the way for him, right, and to point to him. So God was communicating to all people across the earth. So I think these are all topics that fit nicely in Tolkien studies. And while I don't know much about them, I do know about some of the other cultural influences on the text, but the other topics not so much. But I would say that this all fits within what would be a Christian vision of reality. Okay, so that it's not like there's this complete vision and that complete vision. I think that the Christian worldview is a very broad and capacious worldview that makes sense of lots of different disciplines areas of studies, and I think makes the best sense of even scientific exploration and investigation, right? Science fits in better with Christianity than it does with some other worldviews, although it does fit in with other worldviews as well. So I would think, and of course his experience in World War One and living through World War Two, and knowing, people like Lewis who were active in, uh, with soldiers and things like that, and all of these influences are there. But that's not what his story is about. And on the second thing you said, you kind of started with that he's clear about this being a Christian broadly, but specifically Catholic understanding that's found its way into the text. Well, he uses the word deliberately in one letter. He says, "I have deliberately created a story out of certain religious ideas." His words exactly. Those words, certain and deliberate, are pretty powerful indicators of what's going on. So I think it's beyond dispute. But understanding how it's Christian is another thing my book goes into. Is that, what does that mean? Well, like I was just saying, it means that it's a very broad and capacious understanding. It brings a lot of things into its underneath its umbrella. Whereas I think a lot of people come to it and think, oh, it's just going to be about Bible stuff and Jewish stuff and Jesus, and that's it. And it's going to ignore all the Anglo-Saxon imagery and the other topics that Tolkien cared about. And no, not at all. And there have been wonderful authors who have written about all of these subjects and more.
Well, and I was going to say, do you feel like that do you feel like The Lord of the Rings is a Christian story?
Yes, I do. I really do. And I go into in chapter 2 of my book exactly how that is as a good news story. And I make the case that parables are perfect vehicles for communicating the kind of worldview that Christianity is. I think one of the biggest things I talk about in how it's Christian is very broad, is that, like many of the other pre-Christian narratives had this too, and I think it was on purpose because God created all people in his image, is that all these great traditions have creation, fall, redemption, restoration, these 4 parts we typically talk about, 4 themes or parts or acts, if you will. And I specifically, coming back to the Christian definition of these acts, if you will, or themes, I explore how those are borne out in the text. And I think that's what makes it, one of the things that makes it inherently and thoroughly Christian. But another thing is, and I go into the fact that it is bringing in the other pre-Christian mythologies, is another indicator that it's fully Christian, because that's what Christianity claims. I mean, that's another sign. And then last but not least, I talk about the art of the parable, which is an essay slash sermon that one of Tolkien's good friends and correspondents in the letters, Father Robert Murray, who was a Jesuit, he corresponds with about a lot of religious information about the Lord of the Rings. And Murray goes on later in 1992 to write this great little essay on it. And I explore how the Lord of the Rings is a parable and what that means for how it communicates the truth of the Christian worldview. So yeah, I unpack a lot in the book, and it's really a labor of love. I try to address all those big questions, and I have to do it very slowly, but I get to it in time. There's a lot there. Tolkien was a smart guy.
Well, talk to me a little bit more about the idea of parable.
Yeah,
you're
sure.
Talking about the Lord of the Rings as a parable versus an allegory.
Yes.
What does that look like as a if a story is a parable versus an allegory? What does that look like?
Sure. So let's try to imagine a spectrum, if you will. And I kind of set this up in my book, and I didn't want to bog it down with tables, but this is one thing I wish I probably should have done. But as I've said in a lot of my interviews, that if you imagine a spectrum, and it kind of appeared in my mind as I was reading and researching over the years, that it seems, okay, as we said earlier, Tolkien doesn't have a problem with allegory in general, or even allegorical language. So again, distinguishing between composition and mode. But it depends on how it's used and to what end, and how heavily it's leaned on. So if we imagine that, and I make the case that, in saying the Lord of the Rings is a fairy story, and then in that other letter I mentioned, he says it's an allegory, that a fairy story is a type of allegory. So I settle in my book that we have a spectrum. So back to the design, right? The sketch, a spectrum of allegory. And on one end, we might suppose we have the one he disliked. And this is a simple version of what I imagined. And that's the conscious and intentional allegory. And as we said, this is very heavy-handed. the theological vision, the moral messages, the the ultimate thematic content that the author wishes to convey are going to be just obnoxiously obvious. And it's going to be clear that you're reading this story, but the story itself is not well told. It's really a story about another story or about something else. And you're meant to be looking through the story to that something else. And I think this is what Tolkien really disliked. I don't get that sense. It came to me gradually over the years that this was a Christian story, and how it was a Christian story was a very slow process. And I know I may not make it seem that way in the book, but it was very, very slow. So on the other end of the spectrum, we might have parables. And in fact, many biblical scholars have pointed out that parables could be seen and spoken of as a type of allegory. And then according to Snodgrass, who I mentioned earlier, you could reverse it too with little difference. You could say there's a bunch of parables and we can name different kinds of parables, and allegory could be a type. It doesn't really matter. And so I go with the word Tolkien kind of used a lot, which was allegory. So we have our spectrum. We have the one he disliked on one end. On the other end is parable. Now, what makes this different? Parables, if we look to Jesus, if we look at what people have written about Jesus's parables, they're known for being very suggestive and implicit. And I'll kind of put it this way. I can't remember exactly where I got this from, but this is an insight cobbled together from a couple of different authors. But it's something like this, that Jesus established a pattern that when you want to talk about something, you don't talk about what you want to talk about by doing so directly. And so I've done a lot of research in parables as indirect communication. And so we know Jesus was very indirect. He could have just said, "Hi, everybody, I'm God." He doesn't do that. And a lot of skeptics will say, well, yeah, Jesus doesn't say he's God in the Gospels. Well, he does. Actually, he just does it in a very Jewish way, as Brant Petra, a Catholic scholar, said, and we have to understand that. And the way he does it is indirectly through parables. And so parables are indirect. That means they're very suggestive. They're kind of sneaky, if you will. But then they have this twist, this gut punch. And Kreglinger talks about a good parable alternates between that clear, very familiar speech, that allegorical speech, kind of leading you on and luring you in and, making you think it's about one thing, when all of a sudden there's a twist in the story and there's a chink in the story where you can kind of look through and peer through the glass to see, wow, this is a Christian story. And that's that shift, she says, to metaphorical language, where there's a surprise, there's a revelation, and a new insight. And so I know this gets a bit technical, but parables are metaphorical stories, but they also sometimes contain, obviously quite so, as a type of allegory, allegorical language. And they shift between that very clear, transparent speech and that very suggestive speech to keep the listener guessing and challenged, so that you can wrestle with the text probably for years and years. And look at this. I mean, we're still wrestling with the words of Jesus. I think we always will be. And Tolkien's, is a classic. I would never, of course, put it on the same level, but it's a book that is not easy to summarize and reduce and whittle it down to one bullet point. I think it's because it's based on that art of the parable. Jesus, was Tolkien's Lord, and this is who he loved more than anybody. So I think that really shows. So that's just the tip. Sorry.
No, that's great. So when we're looking at the Lord of the Rings, what do you feel like what do you think is the big Christian idea that we should see when we're reading the Lord of the Rings? What's the one thing that, I don't know, I don't know if we should have it in mind when we're reading, or if you feel like this is the one thing we should walk away thinking after we've read it. But that idea.
Yeah. I've got two, but I'll start with just one. At the end of chapter 1 in my book, if you don't mind, I'll read a little something here. The Lord of the Rings as parable. Okay. So I say at the end, and I'm wrapping up the chapter, in conclusion, this book's central thesis, that we can learn more about Christianity and reality from a fantasy book, does seem a bit of a stretch. Can we really learn more about Christianity and reality by entering a story filled with elves, dragons, dwarves, and magical rings? The real question is, can we know anything about reality without myth? We have learned that everyone has a worldview and describes reality in narrative terms. And I go on to say that the Lord of the Rings is a Christian story. But there is this one point, and I think this is it. I'm skipping ahead a little bit to the end, is that it's this message that we still live in a world with brokenness and evil and sin and suffering. And a lot of critics, I'll quote one in a second, Ralph C. Wood, they look at the story, The Lord of the Rings, and they say, oh, you see, it's a sad story. And that means it can't be Christian. And this contradicts exactly what theology teaches us, but also what Tolkien says at the end of On Fairy Stories. He says the Christian has to still suffer and work and die, but he does so with a purpose. He knows it's not all in vain. That's a loose paraphrasation. So I think that's one of the things I challenge some of the prevailing Tolkien scholarship, that no, it's a sad story, and that's what makes it deeply Christian. It's a story that's filled with death, and Tolkien said that one of the major themes was death, and I think that's what makes it Christian. And so I say, Ralph C. Wood, one of the enduring enigmas, he says, left by the conclusion of The Lord of the Rings is how to deal with its surpassing sadness. And I agree. But Wood believes that this is because it is, like the Christian story it resembles, an unfinished story of broken people in a broken world, which is still plagued by the specter of death. But I go on to say that reality is not what it's supposed to be yet. We sense that it ought to be different. I quote Timothy Keller here saying, there's a tragedy and a sadness to life from which no amount of celebration or rejoicing can provide a full escape. And Keller there is talking about the gospel. And I see that in The Lord of the Rings. And so I think it's that consolation that Tolkien spoke about in On Fairy Stories, escape, recovery, consolation. That's one of the biggest things, that the most profound and significant reasons it's a Christian story, is that we should take comfort from the fact that, I know that sounds strange, there is still suffering and death, but we know that Christ is with us, Christ is risen, and things are going to be made new again. So I challenge that notion, because most Tolkien scholars will say, this is why the incarnation is not present in the story. It's still far off. It's not a fully Christian story because it's sad. And I challenge that. So that's the one thing.
Well, and there's even I'm trying to remember the exact quote because I always will get it wrong. And I believe it's Sam to Gandalf, where Sam basically says, are all sad things going to become untrue?
That's it.
I've always thought that's such a poignant idea that, that Tolkien does have this really, really dark story. And, in the end, Frodo is not able to even stay in Middle Earth. He has to leave. But in reality, everything is just being passed on. Everything's being passed on to Sam. Sam is the future. Sam is the hope for what will be. Frodo is what was and what is past.
That's right.
But I've always thought, you were talking about the sadness and death, and it is a huge part of the story. But I think there is hope. But we have to realize the hope is passed on to the next generation.
Well, and you nailed it, and you were right about the quote. And then look at the end of the Lord of the Rings. That's what Frodo says to Sam. To just piggyback on what you said, he says to Sam after he discovers that Frodo's got to move on. It must often be so, Sam, when things are in danger, someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them. And for you nerds out there, this is at the very end, final chapter of Lord of the Rings. So in the one volume edition, it's page 1026 through 29 there. I think that's my Kindle edition. But anyway, it's towards the end. You'll know where it is. And I say this really reminds me of the principle in Matthew 16:25 that whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. And so, that would be the segue into there are plenty of things that I think clearly windows in the story that just, I guess, maybe broken glass that, the sunlight pours through, and we see those glimpses that this is the story of reality, the Christian story being told here, without ruining the story, without spoiling it. In fact, one of Tolkien's fans wrote in once and said, look, I'm not a believer, but it's like there's light from an invisible lamp present in your mythology. And that's exactly the art of the parable. I mean, that's brilliant, is that I can't see it. I mean, I can see the light, but I can't see the source. And that to me is just, it speaks for itself.
Doesn't Tolkien say something about, we tell these myths and these fairy stories in order to make the ideas that we're conveying in them even more real,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
something to that point. You know the
Yes.
quote I'm thinking
I
of,
do vaguely. Yes.
and
It's
it might
coming to
not be
me.
Tolkien it may be somebody else, but
It
they
could have
talk
been
about
Lewis, maybe.
yeah, that's my other thing. I was
They're
thinking it
so,
could be
yeah.
Lewis,
Yeah.
but
Mm-hmm.
they said something about we tell these stories to communicate things that are even more real.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's what myths do. I mean, that it looks at the unseen, which is more real because it's eternal. And of course, today in the modern framework, we tend to privilege empirical things as more real. But philosophy lurks behind the sciences. And that there are assumptions we go into doing science with, and so it already just there shows that the more real is that which we can't see, and it's very powerful. So getting into the topic of myth, which I also talk about a little bit in the introduction, that's another one of those really heavily laden words that just gets so badly misrepresented. But yes, I can't exactly where that is, but that notion is very Tolkien-esque, and Lewis, but both of them
Yeah.
would agree with that sentiment, that thought.
Well,
So
and let's talk a little bit about some of the characters in the Lord of the
yeah.
Rings. A lot of people, and I even did a podcast about it, with the idea of there are some Christ-like figures in the
Mhm.
Lord of the Rings. Now, my take on it is there is not one character who embodies Christ. There's no Aslan, which is a pretty blatantly the Jesus of Narnia.
Absolutely.
There's no Aslan in the Lord of the Rings, but there
Mhm.
are characters who convey some of the aspects of Christ.
Mhm.
Where do you see that in the Lord of the Rings? In which characters do
Sure.
you see? What do you see in them?
Yeah. Well, let me say that somewhere in my book, off the top of my head, I was just looking for it. I can't remember where, but I know I mention it, and I acknowledge the scholarship of many other fantastic scholars. I'm standing on their shoulders for this insight that it's a well-known fact that Tolkien did not put all of his Christian, or I'm sorry, Christ-like characteristics into one character.
Mhm.
I think again, this is a violation of what I say the art of the parable is in the book, borrowing from what Murray said. It's too heavy-handed. It's too obvious.
Right.
And there's some studies and research, and that Tolkien might have been influenced by the Beowulf author here for inspiration. Michael Drought, I
Mm.
believe, has written about this. So um, it's a well-known fact that Tolkien sort of split up the themes and the resonances with the Christian story, and the character traits of Christ, and more broadly the Christian themes across the story and across the peoples of Middle Earth. But
Mhm.
as you said, there are some that stand out more than others. And so,
Yes.
with that preface out of the way, let me say one more thing: is that I fully knowing that I tend to focus in my book, not tend to, I do focus on Aragorn,
Ah.
because the revelation that I got from N.T. Wright and many other biblical scholars in the last decade, that seeing the Christian story as the story of how God became king, not just about how Jesus was divine, but what that
Mhm.
means is that God is in charge of the world. He's reigning. He's putting everything right.
Mhm.
I when I heard that and I looked back on my Lord of the Rings experience, I had this just light bulb went off, and I thought that's what Lord of the Rings is about. And so
Mhm.
I got on this quest to write specifically about Aragorn, because also personally, as I say in the preface, this was tied up with my heart. So knowing that Aragorn is an obvious one, we can come back to him. But let's say, of course, Frodo is another quite obvious and probably main character, and Gandalf. And in many ways in which people would not, everybody talks about his fight with the Balrog, and their subterranean and then mountain climbing. In the book, it's just so much better.
Yes.
Um, I mean, the extended edition of the Two Towers gets some of it okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does, but it's cool to see that. But yeah, there's some things there, obviously, with the resurrection, but it's also in Gandalf's role as a prophet, as an advisor, not as prophets aren't fortune tellers, but as a person that keeps the kings of Israel honest, that
Mm.
speaks on behalf of God, and sees the storyline, and sees God's fingerprints everywhere.
Mm.
Gandalf has that and then also that Odin-like resonance too. So there's that other culture coming in. So I think you've got the three, and that corresponds to the three high offices of Christ as a king, prophet, and priest. I think from the letter to Hebrews in the New Testament. So yeah, those are the big three. But I'm sure, and I know that others have written about Sam and Merry and Pippin, Eowyn, that there are just so many examples of Christ throughout all of these characters, and we could talk about one or any of them. So,
Well,
or all of them, really.
you do focus on Aragorn.
Hmm.
So kind of walk me through some of the things you see in Aragorn that kind of represent Christ specifically.
Yeah, I was just trying to look for something exactly that I say here in chapter. For those of you that are interested in looking at the book, chapter 3 is where I really take off. I take a retrospective journey through Tolkien's books. We look at the Lord of the Rings in chapter 3, the Hobbit in chapter 4, some of the Silmarillion, and the debate of Finrod and Andreth, which is a part of the History of Middle Earth series in chapter 5. So some really nerdy stuff there, and that's a very difficult text, the debate, and it's really beautiful. But I think one of the things that really struck me when I first read it, and I was, in my journey studying, learning more about Jesus, was the discovery of the sapling towards the end, after Aragorn enters the city of Minas Tirith at the end of the Return of the King, and I think this precedes. I think it's the coronation, then the discovery, and then his marriage to Arwen. I might have them mixed up, but I talk about them in my book. And those three events, the coronation, the discovery of the sapling, which goes all the way back to Valinor, right, as a descendant of the tree, the two
Right.
trees. Um, and Gandalf's words about it, to keep it planted, reminded me, and I talk about this in chapters 2 and 3, of the already and not yet theme in the gospel. Is that's the Christian story in a nutshell, is that Christ has to keep on reigning and put all enemies under his feet. We know he's won the great victory with his crucifixion and resurrection, but the story isn't finished. The already, the not yet. And I got that picked up with that conversation, that exchange that Gandalf and Aragorn have on the slopes of Mount Mindalluin, which is the mountain that Minas Tirith is built on. And it's a cool exchange. I think there's a lot there. Obviously, the revelation imagery and just the idea of Arwen and Aragorn coming together, resonance with the unification of Christ and his church, and Christ and Israel, Israel being a bride being brought to the bridegroom. I explore some of those things. I talk about how through parable, it's not a one for one. It's not very allegorical with the paths of the dead, which is one of my favorite things that from the book. Um, Again, it's not Aragorn doesn't die, but he
Right.
does in a sense. So you
Right.
might think, well, if it's an allegory, well, if it were more allegorical, and let's say maybe less parabolic or less metaphorical, then it would be he would have gone in, he would have died, and then he would have come out on the other side alive. And
Right.
then we'd say, oh, wow, that's like Gandalf, and oh, that's the resurrection. But that's not what happens. Um, Instead, I also talk about how that event reminds us of another often debated event in New Testament scholarship from the letter First Peter. I think chapter 3 and elsewhere in that letter. I'm a little rusty on exactly which chapter, but I know it's First Peter, about the harrowing of hell, the descent into Hades or Sheol. It's not quite hell; that's a whole nother topic. But Christ preaching among the dead, and that I explore too. So again, a cluster of things I examine in chapter 3 about Aragorn, and the challenge of the Palantir, where he reveals himself to Sauron in the book, and also in the extended edition. I think there's a scene, isn't there, where he grabs the Palantir,
Yes.
and is it the Return of the
He
King? I think.
reveals himself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's it's a great moment. And so I explore those and others that really just say Aragorn, Jesus,
Yeah.
but not in a way that hammers you on the head. It's
Right.
tantalizing. So
Yeah, I like the I like the idea that um, if you're going to try to make it line up, if you're going to try to make Aragorn line up with Jesus, the outline is kind of, you know, in early on he's rough and rugged, and Jesus is a simple carpenter,
Mhm.
and at some point later he finally reveals himself, his glory, to
Mhm.
his disciples, and to you know so Aragorn reveals himself to his
Mhm.
companions, because they all stand in awe of him, going, he's never looked like this before.
That's right. Yeah.
Then you talked about the paths of the dead. If you
Mhm.
want to equate the paths of the dead to the crucifixion, which is, you're right, it's not exactly the same, but
Yeah, but it's a little bit.
when he comes out, he is kind of the king triumphant at that
That's
point.
right.
So
Exactly.
it is an interesting fit if you think through it that way.
Mhm.
Um, was Tolkien thinking through all of those things when he wrote that? I
Mm.
don't know, or I don't know he has specifically wanted that to happen that way, or if he was just thinking about these kind of ideas, or they were just so steeped in who he was that they
Yeah.
couldn't help but come out.
That's what he basically alludes to, Ricky. Exactly. He says, "Look, I didn't write The Lord of the Rings consciously as a Catholic story." Although then he says elsewhere, "I've deliberately written a story." So Tolkien was weird. But to finish my sentence,
I've
a
read
quote,
some of that. I'm like, wait, you did or you didn't? I'm not
which
sure.
can
Depends
you
on which
clarify?
interview you listen to. No,
Exactly,
like
exactly.
every other author in the
You
world.
know, exactly right. I'm thinking of some modern fantasy authors. So, um,
Yeah, I know you're thinking of J.K. Rowling right now.
yes, yes, yes. So, oh man, that's another thing to give some thought to. So he says not consciously at first, but unconsciously Christian in the revision. And I just was recently on the Tolkien Road podcast with John Carswell, kind of helping him co-host, and we talked about this. The debate of Finrod and Andreth was kind of a meditation on what he had written, and there are some that think from the History of the Middle Earth series that it's clear Tolkien, and according to his son Christopher, that he was trying to make everything kind of, oh yeah, this really is Christian. Well, let me make sure that really makes sense with that. And wow, I didn't realize how Christian it was. And so he really means that when he didn't consciously plan that. And I think because he didn't, that's why we don't get those one for one, like the past of the dead we were talking
Right.
about. And that's what I think, that's why it's great, because it respects the reader. It doesn't say you're gonna see this as Christian and you're gonna like
Right.
it. It's just there. It just seeps, out of his pores into the story naturally, which is brilliant. It's brilliant.
You said something right there that I think is important in all. This is something I have tried to convince people of in Christian media, whether it's writing, TV, movies, and I have been a bit of a filmmaker in the past, and I've had this idea of, can Christians make good media that isn't doesn't have to be beat you over the head Christian?
Mm,
But you said it was natural.
mm,
And I think that is probably the most important part of something like The Lord of the Rings. If you come to it from a Christian perspective, you're going to see the Christian ideas flowing from it.
yep.
If you come at it from a secular viewpoint, you're still going to get the moral story,
Mm,
but you're not going to feel like you were beat over the head with a Bible.
exactly.
And I think that
Exactly.
is powerful, and I think it keeps the door open just enough for a believer to have a conversation with an unbeliever about, well, hey, I know you really liked this story.
Mm,
Have you ever experienced? Have you ever read what the Bible says about stories like this? The kind of stories like
yes.
this.
And that's such an important part of evangelism slash apologetics, what some people call pre-evangelism. And I agree with you
Yes.
100%. I think what that is, Ricky, is indirect communication, which there are so many great books. Mine talks about it, but not to the extent in a systematic way. If you're interested in this, folks, There's a book called Hide and Seek: The Sacred Art of Indirect Communication. Really good book. Another Whitman Stock author. They produce a lot of great books. This one's a jewel, though, and I'm not just saying that. It really, there's a lot of, people overlook the smaller pub. I mean, they're not small, but it's not Zondervan, so people think, oh, it can't be good. But yeah, it is. It's such a great topic, and you find that people are turned off by the heavy-handed Bible thumping approaches. Because why? And I've talked with some Christians, and they're saying, oh, well, they're not ready for the gospel. No, that's not it. Look to Jesus. This isn't, he got angry sometimes, yes, of course, but this was never his way. And I think if we miss the indirect communication aspect of how Jesus communicated the gospel, not only are we going to miss the forest through the trees with our communications, but we're also not preaching incarnationally, which I talk a lot about in the book too, that we've got to preach to the whole person and share with the whole person. They're not just mind, they're not just body, they're not just soul. They're a complex network of all, and so we have to keep that in mind. And so I think it's important to learn to speak and to think indirectly. And so that's a really great study. So I think people ought to really look into it more, especially if you are involved in ministry or just interested in talking with friends that are seekers and skeptics or unbelievers of varying kinds. So very important.
Absolutely. Well, tell me this real quick. Now I know that The Hobbit is a pretty easy read.
Yeah.
And for those who are listening, obviously we are focusing heavily on the books, although we kind of alluded to the movies a couple of times. Really, the kind of stuff we're talking about, I think you're going to get a better connection reading the books than seeing the movies. Some of it is in the movies, but I don't think it's as strongly a part of the films. But The Hobbit is a fairly easy read. The Lord of the Rings is a little more difficult read, plus its sheer volume. But the debate and the Silmarillion are pretty heavy reading. Sell me on why somebody should take the time to read those particular volumes.
Well, I mean, I would say it's especially important if you're Christian, because you're going to find that Tolkien scholars like Brad Berzer, for example, who has written a book on Tolkien, say that the most theologically rich and incarnational and therefore Christian of probably all of these texts is the debate, which is in volume 10, Morgoth's Ring of the History of Middle-earth, for those of you that are interested. And so that's an impetus and encouragement to read it. It's difficult, but actually I wouldn't say the debate is all that difficult. If you read it slowly, it's actually not as dense as the Silmarillion, even though I think it was originally supposed to be part of it. So it's a fairly easy read. It's almost like reading Job, and some, like Berzer, have described it as a Job-like dialogue. And that's exactly what it is. And because it's a dialogue, it's also more engaging to read. So I think it's more approachable. So now you know where to find it. And I reproduce text in chapter 5. The Silmarillion, I find best is to read slowly and in parts. And I think you can hop around so long as you get yourself a good guide, or and I know, for example, the Tolkien Road, they give out free guides to the Silmarillion. And so you understand the structure. And if you do, I would say start with the Ainul Indale, the creation myth, and read it carefully and prayerfully and slowly. It is very King James-like, English. So it's a difficult read, but it's theologically rich writing, and it really lays open, I think, if we look at the Christian story in the four acts, the creation and fall aspects are really heavily alluded to, and the redemption aspect is hinted at in the debate. But read the Ainul Indale if you really want to see the creation of Tolkien's universe and understand the vision behind the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, and how the dwarves and the elves and men all interacted and came into being, and then also wrapping your mind around the plurality of divine beings, which is another interesting thing. The work of Mike Heiser has been really influential on my understanding, is that it isn't that Tolkien was thinking of the Trinity, he wasn't thinking polytheistically, but the Valar are God's divine counsel. You think of Psalm 82 and several hundreds of other verses in the Bible where God is surrounded with other divine beings that are part of his divine family They're not equal to him. They're contingent beings, like we're contingent. Um, but you get all that, and I think, well, obviously Tolkien wasn't aware of Heiser's work. Heiser is just uncovering things that have been, seen before, but they're just becoming more popular again. I think Tolkien was aware of this henotheistic sort of layer to Jewish monotheism, and so I think you really get inside his mind. So I think it's important people read it. I'm trying to sell you on it as best as I can. The world is born into through music, and it's beautiful. So if you love the arts too, and you're a music person, you'll appreciate it. There's so many good reasons to read it.
Well, let me ask you this: in the Lord of the Rings, the trilogy,
Mm-hmm.
who is your favorite character? Who do you most connect with when you are reading the Lord of the Rings?
Ooh, I would say either Aragorn or Faramir. Faramir is sensitive. He's transparent. He wears his heart on his sleeve, but he's thoroughly courageous and also a reflective person. And his familial issues, are something that a lot of sons could probably relate to. And people, also daughters too, in different ways. But so I think Faramir is one. And I think somebody, especially after I finished writing my book, I kind of realized I overlooked, and I don't talk about Faramir in my book, but it's something I've come to now as a fan, returning to the text, kind of say, I missed this before. And so that's been fun. So I'm not tired. I'm not bored of the rings yet. I don't think I'll ever be. And then there's Aragorn, and that's how my journey got started. I just, I not only wanted to be him, to be like him, but to be, to follow him, to be part of that fellowship, to have an important mission. And so I connected. Some of these yearnings that I have and still have in my own heart just sync up. He's an example of great virtue and humility, and so it's an easy pick for me.
Awesome. Well,
Yeah.
I'm gonna put you on the spot. A lot
Sure.
of people will gravitate to Sam as
Yeah.
being the humble hero. That
Hmm.
how do you feel about Sam in the Lord of the Rings?
The movies kind of ruined Sam for me in some sense. I mean, he's not completely poorly depicted, I think, but he's, I don't know. Sometimes I don't know if I have the right vocabulary for it off the top of my head, but there's a whininess sometimes about him that's present in the movies that's not in the book. So
Yes,
I don't
I
know
would
if other
agree.
people. Okay, maybe that's the word then. So yeah, I can see why people. I mean, in the book, he speaks in like a different dialect, and obviously a poorer, less educated dialect, and he's an everyman, and I think there's much to appreciate there. But it's another character I haven't really come around to looking at again until after I finished my book, and so usually during the autumn, I reread The Lord of the Rings, and I've just started this September. Obviously, it kind of lines up with the beginning of the book too, so I'm looking for new things, but just because I don't see it, I mean, plenty of other people have. So I can see why. He has a huge and influential part in completing the quest. I mean, but for many other reasons, I'm sure too.
When you're reading through, what is what's kind of your favorite part of the Lord of the Rings? When you're
Hmm.
starting a read, what's the part that you go, this is the thing I want to get to as quickly as possible because I love reading this section?
Let me give you two. Okay. I mean, I have so many, but one is kind of a weird
Me too.
one.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'm with you. It's hard to
That's how
pick
it.
one.
Yeah, that's how it should be. Um, so in both the beginning of The Hobbit, in the first chapter, and also I think in The Shadow of the Past, second chapter of The Fellowship of the Ring, it's Wanderlust. There are these comments that Tolkien makes, like after the dwarves finish singing. I just recently read this to my students too, and I could see it in their eyes that they seem to really be affected by it too. Um, where Bilbo was reminded of all the beautiful things in the world, and the narration that Tolkien does after the Misty Mountain song is concluded, and he thinks of waterfalls and mountains and carrying a sword instead of a walking stick. That wanderlust, really, I don't know, something about it. First of all, it makes me want to move out of Florida. uh, Second of all, and I've seen mountains and waterfalls, but I want to see them again. So it resonates with me. To the Lord of the Rings, you've got that Frodo likes to go walking in the autumn and bump into different travelers, and he always felt a restlessness during the fall, and so I always get excited when I read that because it's like reading me. It's like the book gets me, and I think it just it taps into something, and it just gets me excited about reading the books again. But then Tom Bombadil would be the other one, and
Yes.
I mean, I've just started getting into this lore again too. There's plenty written about him, but just mysterious is the word, and I want to know more. Um, the the food descriptions, the poetry, the singing, the way that the baths are described, just the way that the scenes are written, and the hospitality and warmth of Bombadil's house after going through the old forest, is great. I look forward to it. So
awesome. So Michael, you've got a great book. You didn't write it all that long ago, correct?
Last September came out.
Last September it came out. How long did it take you to write the book?
Ooh, I started penning the notes that would become chapters in 2012, but I officially started, heavy research and like sitting down to write because I had my first contract in 2015. I switched publishers after 4 years actually, because we had a disagreement of vision, especially with regards to the Christian vision of the book. So from 2015 to 2019, I was with McFarland Publishers, and then I moved to Whip-Stock in 2019. So really, to write it 5 years, solid writing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, so what's your next book?
I'm reading the Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. We just started, and it got me thinking. I know there are a lot of books about Harry Potter and Narnia, but I want to do something probably with C.S. Lewis. What I'm considering, based on several advice of friends and reviewers of the book, that doing the treatment that I've done here, but now that I've kind of honed my craft to obviously shrink a lot of the fat that's in the first book, and I think I can accomplish what I accomplished in this book much quicker and more succinctly, and do it with Lewis. And one of the things that I'd like to show is, like I did in this book, how the art of the parable applies to what Lewis called supposals. He talked about supposals in his letters to people, which really reads like a description of parable. And so to basically give C.S. Lewis the good news of the Return of the King treatment, as I'll call it, but the gospel in Narnia, something like that. So I am kind of thinking down those lines. I have a good friend that I'm hopefully either he's going to co-author or he's going to be researching it with me and get some sort of credit. I don't know yet, but it's on the radar. I've got some things typed up, and then maybe something with J.K. Rowling after that, but I don't know. Definitely Lewis. So
very cool. Well,
thanks.
In 5 years when you have it written,
should be a lot less. My kids are growing a little bit older.
When you have that, definitely going to have you back on the show to talk about all these things at some point. And no doubt when you're ready for your next book, let me know. I would love to have you back on the show to talk about your next book. But
it'd be my privilege.
When we're talking about Lord of the Rings, I'm definitely going to be giving you a call.
Please.
Anything else? Anything else you want to share before we go?
No, just that I'm very grateful to appear on your podcast, and I appreciate you taking the time to read as much of my book as you could. And before the interview, I know not everybody is able to do that, so thank you for taking the time to consider what I've written and to share your time and your podcast with me. Thank you.
Absolutely. And my plan is to finish your book probably this weekend. It really is. I really have gotten fascinated. The ideas that you're throwing out there, that, especially the part about the allegory and where he says it is, but then he says he doesn't like that.
A lot of back and forth. Yeah.
But, as we've discussed, Tolkien did kind of vacillate between ideas from time to time.
Yes, he did. So
And
just taking the
everybody
time to
just
read
talks
it, I
about the one
appreciate it.
time. So, yeah,
Oh, I know.
absolutely worth reading. If
Thank
you
you.
are interested in Michael's book, I will have links down in the show notes where you can get a copy of his book. And Michael, where can people connect with you?
Thanks, Ricky. www.mythicmission.com is my podcast / second professor page. I have an official professor page with St. Petersburg College. If you just Google me, that'll come up. But that other website is a great way to stay in touch. I have a blog there, all of my interviews and things that I'm doing on my podcast. So everything is there. I'm on Facebook, Twitter. I'm not really so active on Instagram or LinkedIn, but my book has a page on Facebook as well. So I'm visible. I'm out there. I'm easy to find.
Awesome. Well, Michael, it has been a pleasure having you on the show today.
Pleasure has been mine. Thank you, Ricky.
It was great chatting with Michael, and consider getting a copy of Michael's book, The Good News of the Return of the King, The Gospel in Middle-earth. And I'll put a link down below where you can order it. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, click all those links down below. And you can find all of our social links, our online store, and links to our YouTube channel at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. And while you're there, click on the support tab. We would love to have you as a Patreon. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing, and this one's a little bit different. This is the blessing that Elrond gave Gandalf when they were leaving Rivendell in the Fellowship of the Ring. Look not too far ahead, but go now with good hearts. Farewell, and may the blessing of elves and men and all free folk go with you. May the stars shine upon your faces. We'll see you next week. Blessings.